What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and whatever time it is, and welcome back to yet another video with your man, Emergaholic. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another faction overview for the Divided Impera overhaul mod for Total War Rome 2. Today, we are checking out the Arevaci, otherwise known as the Arevaci and the Arevaci. I go with Arevaci just because that's the way that I first heard it spoken. It's the most common way that I've heard it be spoken, so that's just what I'm sticking with. But as always, with my mispronunciations, I mean no disrespect. It's just what I've grown up with because I've played the Total War games and other strategy games that mention these factions for quite a while now, and so that's just stuck with me. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let's jump into it. But just very quickly before we do, I will link my official Emergaholic Discord down below if you do want to get involved in the community, especially some of the polls that we actually vote on for future campaigns, not just for Rome 2 Dividing Impera, but for other stuff as well. Get involved in the Discord and you will see a polls channel there where you yourself can vote and have a say on what kind of content we have on the channel. Right now we're currently voting on our next faction for a Total War campaign. It's down between two finalists right now, and it's up to you guys to figure out who you want to see be chosen for our next faction. And the vote was pretty close, although it is starting to sway a certain way right now at the time of recording, but who knows, maybe you can jump in and change things. Anyway, that's it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the Arevaci. Okay, so obviously this is part of the Iberi cultural group, otherwise known as the Iberians, or also the Celt-Iberians. This is not just purely Iberian people who are native to the area of Iberia, but it's also part of the Celtic tribes that migrated to Iberia and blended with the Iberians, ergo becoming the Celt-Iberians. And the Arevaci are basically the representatives of the Celt-Iberians, or at least a section of the Celt-Iberian society in Iberia. The Editani are basically representative of the Eastern Iberians, or the southeastern ones. The Lusitani are the far more isolated Western Iberians, and the Arevaci are generally considered to be the Celt-Iberians, out of these three factions, that is. But anyway, you share the following two perks with the Lusitani and the Editani. First off, you have the Horsemanship buff, which gives +1 experience rank for all cavalry units. This is actually quite good, because this is present no matter what your government type is. Some government types actually give you +1 XP rank. It doesn't matter for you. You're automatically going to get that for every single cav unit you have, and in my opinion, having that +1 XP rank is very helpful. It automatically gives you at least +1 attack and +1 melee defense, which can always help you out and get a little bit of an edge over your enemies. In addition, you also have the Devotio buff, where you have an increased attribute for all generals, which applies to the statistics of your generals, such as cunning, authority, and then what's the other one? I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I'll think of it once we're in there. But anyway, it applies to those kinds of traits. So that's interesting, not groundbreaking, but it just gives you basically more experienced generals, so that can only be a good thing. But yeah, it's not going to win you a campaign necessarily. Furthermore, just for the Arevaci though, we have the following buffs and debuffs. We have the Resolute Resistors buff, which increases morale when defending. Note, it doesn't say that you have to be defending only in your territory, it just says any kind of defense. So if we take that literally, that means any defending battle you get at all on the campaign map, you will have better morale. So that's really interesting. It could mean that you might want to tailor your playstyle to be defensive and force the enemy to come to you if possible, because morale is always going to be an issue for any barbarian faction. Even with the high tier units, if they get isolated and their general dies, they will rout like a lot of other basic barbarian units. So especially if you're going up against someone like Rome or Carthage, who is much more disciplined. Then we have the One People buff, which gives you a diplomatic bonus with Iberians, or all people under the Iberian cultural group. This is actually really powerful because early on in the campaign, it means that almost every single Iberian faction around you is willing to be a friend and friends then can quickly become allies and trade partners. So that's actually pretty powerful. It helps you have a easier time in the early game, but it doesn't mean you'll have an easy early game necessarily. And then you have the mercenary life debuff though, which decreases immigration to your capitals, which basically means that you will have a lower population coming into your capital from immigration. It's not massive, but immigration over time can make your capitals be very powerful, very economical, and very good for recruiting masses of armies. So I could see that being a bit of an issue. But at the end of the day, you're surrounded by other Iberians, so you can rely on expanding and actually getting the populations that you take over to fight for you pretty easy. So at the end of the day, not a groundbreaking debuff, but it is going to sting just a little bit, especially if you build tall and not wide. But anyway, that's enough about the buffs and debuffs. Let's jump into the campaign map overview. Timestamps will be in the description of this video, so you can just hover over the video and check out the part 1, part 2, and part 3 sections as always. But anyway, let's do it. Let's check out the campaign overview for the Arevaci. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the part 1 section of this video, where we'll check out the campaign situation for the Arevaci. As you can see, we are a one-hitter quitter faction. That's right, we have the single city known as Numantia with the resource of copper being produced. Where can we see it? Oh, we can't see it. Oh, over here. There it is. We can see you have 10 copper being produced, and Numantia is part of the province of Hispania. You share Hispania with Carthage and the people known as the Editani. Carthage has its main capital of Hispania down here, all the way at the city of Mastia. The Editani have us. I know, guys. I've heard all the jokes, and I've made a few too myself. I'm not too proud to admit it. And then this also actually includes the Balearic Islands, known as the city of Ibossum over here to the east. So immediately you can tell that you have a fairly large province to start off with. However, one thing to keep in mind is that geographically it's actually a very large province. And Numantia is all the way up here in central Iberia, almost in northern Iberia really. And you have to go all the way down here to get to Mastia, which becomes New Carthage and is basically extremely far away from you. It's going to take a fair bit of marching to combine all of these cities under your control. And even if you do, all of these other cities are coastal settlements. You're a barbarian faction, which means that your navy naturally sucks. And that's true in the case for the Arevaci, unfortunately. However, Carthage has one of the single best navies in the game. It's a fantastic navy. So if you take any of these settlements and declare war on Carthage, you really have the major concern that Carthage can send in one of their fleets and just take one of your cities with one of your pathetic garrisons. And they can do it, and they will do it. It's not uncommon for their AI to attack your cities, especially if you're doing a head-to-head campaign. Other players will do it as well. If they see you have a coastal settlement with a weak faction, with a weak garrison, then they'll hit it, because why not? Come in and liberate the city, create a new faction, do whatever. So be very careful. You don't necessarily want to rush and unify your home province. You might want to focus on taking some of the cheaper and easier provinces, such as up here to your north. You have Tarraconensis. There you go. I nailed it. Don't worry, guys. I got this. Which has just 3 cities that are all to your north. They're still a fairly spread out province. This province is still fairly spread out. And then to your southwest, you have a couple other provinces. All in all, they're not too hard to unify. You might want to focus on going southwest or going north instead of immediately going southeast. However, that will tie a little bit more into our diplomacy once we get to it. But first off, though, I want to talk about your economy. Now, like I said, you have the resource known as copper in Numantia, and then down in Ars there is some olives, and that is it for your home province at this time. You don't really have all that much going on. Copper is a nice resource to have and will help you recruit heavy infantry. In fact, from turn 1 you have -2 heavy unit recruitment costs. You can see it on the left hand side of the screen, but as soon as I go away, of course here we go, I can do this. Where is it? Yeah, right here. -2 heavy unit recruitment cost. If we go all the way up to level 4, what does that change to? -6%. Yeah, okay, so that's the highest it gets, which isn't massive, but it is helpful. But anyway, copper is a fairly helpful resource to you, and people will want to trade with you for it. However, despite this, your economy still kinda sucks. You have just around 2.5 grand coming in per turn. All you have is your army here with 2 units besides your general's bodyguard, which is a fairly costly infantry unit for some reason. It doesn't give you the cavalry general, although you can get one if you like. And then you have a single spy here, and that's it. And this is all the money you're making. Now, it's not too terrible because you are a barbarian faction, which means your military should be cheaper than normal. However, the Arevaci aren't necessarily as cheap as a faction, say like the Nervii, who spam a bunch of naked warriors who have fairly low maintenance. Your guys are a little bit more expensive, although not all that much compared to more civilized factions such as Carthage and Rome. For example, your Celtiberian swordsmen have an upkeep of 136 if you recruit them in your starting army. Your cavalry here have a upkeep of 155. A little bit more costly, but it's still not all that bad considering this cav unit is actually pretty friggin' useful. However, if you do want to have the better hard-hitting units, the cost does kind of fly up fairly quickly. For example, the cavalry that you can recruit as mercenaries is around the 300s, and the most elite of which is around 353. That's very expensive, and that really cuts into your economy. You almost... that would be probably like cutting out around 1/8 of your income just for getting a single unit. That's not really worth it in my opinion. If it was elephants, then sure. But if it's a cav unit, that is, its stats are pretty decent, but they're not as good as your high elite cav that you get in your core roster. That's really iffy, man, and that's really cutting into your economy early on. And you will need good cavalry, though, to deal with Carthage and Rome, especially when they finally come to Iberia, which they will. They almost always do in every campaign. So my point is, your economy doesn't start in a great position. You are landlocked, so you can't trade with other people. And your military, while it's not the cheapest that there is, it's still fairly cheap. So it's a little bit of a mixed message that you can have with your economy. My point is that basically be careful with how many high-tier cavalry units you get in your army and how many elite infantry units you get in your army. It can be very tempting to span them out fairly early because you can get access to some pretty high-tier units pretty quickly if you focus on researching technology to upgrade your barracks and your home city buildings to level 3 and 4. So I'll talk a little bit more about your economy in the verdict section of this video, but my point is that it is a fairly generic barbarian economy. However, your units cost a little bit more than, say, some Celtic factions or some of the Germans with their cheaper units. Alrighty, let's move forward now. We will talk about your diplomacy, and this is one of the rare cases where you basically get to decide whatever the hell you want diplomatically. Because of that bonus we talked about at the beginning of this video, where you have a bonus versus, bonus with other Iberian factions. You can come over here and hover over the middle symbol, or the symbol that should be on the right if there's no hand symbol. It will tell you the culture of that faction. If it says Iberian in the middle there, like it does right here for the Cantabria, that means that you should have a bonus in diplomatic relations with them. So all of our neighbors literally start off as friendly. And it doesn't just say that, they're actually almost all willing to get trade and non-aggression with you if possible. However, once you start choosing different factions, and like say for example I got a non-aggression pact and trade with the Editani, if in the next turn they declared war on the Carpetani, that means even though the Carpetani are friendly with me right now, that means they're going to start to hate me because I'm allied, well basically in alliance with their enemy. So just because they all start off friendly with you at the beginning, it does not mean that it will stay that way for long. Your decisions do have a lasting impact, diplomatically speaking. But like I said, it does give you the option to choose where and what you do. For example, you could focus on pacifying the North diplomatically. Get the Cantabria to be a friend and ally. let them fight the Galeki to the northwest and any other goals coming from the northeast. All the while, you conquer all of southern and central Iberia. Who cares? It's up to you. Or you could do it the complete opposite way. I wouldn't recommend it. Instead, I'd actually suggest you go south. But you could, in theory, get non-aggression pacts of all the people in the south, take out the north, and then go up into Gaul. It's up to you. And that's one of the nicer things about this campaign, which you can't really say for many other campaigns at all. Usually, the diplomacy kind of steers you towards war with one of your neighbors almost immediately. However, in this case, it doesn't really seem to be the case. The only caveat I would add to your diplomacy is that Carthage, when you do meet them, unless you're already fighting their enemies, they don't like you to begin with, and in fact it can lead to war fairly early on if you border them pretty quickly. However, Carthage is very spread out, and so they might struggle to send armies your way. The AI can really struggle to handle such a large front when they're fighting multiple enemies. However, if they're only fighting, say, you and one other Iberian faction, then that's where you're going to notice that they'll have more armies in Iberia than what you might expect. And if they do that, you can very easily get run over because their armies are easily better than your own. So do be careful about that. But overall, diplomacy is looking pretty solid. Your main enemy will be Carthage if and when you do border them, and that's if you don't play your cards right and basically allowing yourself to be vested in their interest. Alrighty, so now we need to talk about population. The population situation for the Arevaci. If we go to your city, we can check it out that you currently have 30,000 people living in Numantia at the beginning of the campaign, which isn't a bad number at all, especially considering you're a pretty small village in the middle of nowhere, really. However, one thing to keep in mind is that your elite social class is only at 1,200, which is actually very low, and your warriors class is only at 3,800. That number is a little bit more typical. However, this is where the Arevaci kind of get screwed, and in my opinion, it's almost a little unfair, really. Especially comparing them to, say, like the Lusitani, who's a lot of their units that the Lusitani get to the southwest are actually based on a lower social class, at least at the time of this patch, which is the 1.2.7 patch, FYI. However, the Arevaci kind of get screwed, where a lot of their units come from the warrior's social class. Your cavalry comes from the warrior's social class. Your Celtiberian swordsmen come from that. Your Celtiberian painted warriors too. Your Celtiberian light infantry. Your Scutari. Your spearmen. Do we have any here? We have 2 freemen here with your Celtiberian light spearmen. Pretty cheap subpar spear unit. Not really all that helpful. Well, that's not too terrible, but its armor is at 8, so take from that what you will. Has a big defense at 16, or typically 14 though. Your Iberian levy, so this is your most basic bottom tier unit, comes from your freeman social class. What else do we have? And then your skirmishers that you get access to. They're freemen, but they're really bad. They're not very good at all. You really struggle in the skirmishing department. The one thing that's cool about your skirmishers is that you have some units like these Celtiberian ambushers that actually are pretty decent in melee and can actually help you out in getting some nice recharges on the enemy. But looking at just what you can recruit instantly on turn 1, the majority of it comes from your warrior's social class. At least the majority of your good units that you'll really need to be relying upon. Furthermore, if we go to your mercenary section, we can see you have 1 unit here that's from the foreigners. Do we have any others? Nope. You have 1 unit that is considered a foreigner, which is the Cantabrian mercenary horse skirmisher unit. And they only have 4,800 in the city of Numantia, which isn't terrible. But it does mean that if you had more mercenaries available, or that would be under the foreigner social class, then that would be a big issue. Well, not a big issue, but it could become an issue fairly quickly. But in the meantime, you have another cavalry unit here that you might want to get because it actually is pretty good, but it only comes from your elite social class. And then in the meantime, we have 1, 2, and 3 more units that you will be wanting to use in your armies because they're actually pretty freaking solid, especially your Balearic Slingers. But you have 3 of these units that come from your Warrior Social class as well. And that's including the Balearic Slingers. One of the best slingers in the game comes from your most demanded social class for your units. So there is one more thing to keep in mind about your social class, which is a little bit of a silver lining in this dark cloud, and that is that all of Iberia is Iberian, just about. You do have cities to the south that are more Punic, for example, Marcia, and then there's a city over here I can't remember the name of. It's not coming to me. Gadir, that's right. I knew it was a G. That's Punic as well, obviously. So they won't have as much population to offer to you. However, all of your neighbors are Iberian, which means once you take over their cities, you should be getting the full force of their population at your disposal. There won't be too many foreigners, at least there shouldn't be. Depends on how the AI handles their cities and all of that. But anyway, the point is that once you conquer a city, you can replace your losses and recruit more armies pretty easily. The main issue is when it's time to move out of Iberia and go up into Gaul or go down into Africa. And that's where you're going to be really struggling to replenish your men who are on a far long distance campaign. That's where you're going to have to start really relying on AUR and Merc units, or just foreigners in general. If you can recruit them in Iberia, recruit them so you can replace them easily when you're on campaign. But the bottom line is that your population is going to be a pretty heavy balancing act. It's not too extreme like, say, Sparta is, but if you don't pay attention to it, especially with those warrior class units, which is a lot of your units, then you can get screwed. And if you run out of those units, you'll be relying just on your foreigners, which at this point is just one single cavalry unit, which is decent. It's not bad, but it's not amazing. It's very expensive too, by the way, at 273 per turn upkeep. And then you'll have to rely basically on levy spearmen. That's pretty much what these spearmen are. And some skirmishers, which skirmishers are pretty bad, but they do have okay melee attack stats considering they're a skirmisher. But that's it for your population. Bit of a mixed bag. Be careful of your warrior social class is the bottom line. And then we have one final little tidbit that I want to throw you away, which is you start off as a tribal confederation. Usually I don't worry too much about the government types and what you start off as. However, it must be discussed because you have a -10 to loyalty for all political parties. I would recommend, depending on the traits of the other political parties, which you can find out by going to your politics screen, come here, check them all out, and see how much of a struggle it will be to keep these guys aligned with your faction, obviously. If it is going to be a struggle, then I would say change your political government type to be a chiefdom. You can't change it to anything else except an empire. You can't even change it to a kingdom, which kind of sucks. It'd be really cool if you could, but as far as I could tell, it's not possible. But yeah, I would recommend you upgrade to a chiefdom. You get +1 XP rank for all of your units, which is very nice. The +5% tax rate's helpful, but the main thing is that instead of having -10 loyalty for all your political parties, it'll be just 5, and 5 is much more manageable. Still not ideal, but yeah, it's definitely an upgrade from being a tribal confederation, in my opinion. I will do a more in-depth guide, by the way, on government types in the very near future. I'm actually already working on one at this point. But yeah, for the Arevaci at least, I would recommend you go to a chiefdom unless you get very lucky and all of your other political parties are happy with your rule. But anyway, that's it for now. Now let's jump into the part 2 section of this video where we check out the military of the Arevaci. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the part 2 section of this video where we'll finally be checking out the military of the Arevaci, and here we are with your General's Bodyguard unit. One of a few you could get, although it is your only General's Bodyguard unit that is a cav unit. Your other unit is a sword unit and a spear unit, I believe. But this is the main one you're going to want. Generally, cavalry is always better to be using for your generals, unless you want them to be a governor. But even then, they're still going to be super powerful in a city defense as a cav unit, believe it or not. But anyway, that's a thing for another video. This is your General's Bodyguard unit. It's a Celtiberian General's Bodyguard. Decent stats overall. It's very much akin to doing long-term melee engagements because you have good armor and good defense and attack. However, it also has a lance that you can see here, which means that it will be fairly good on the charge. And it has a charge bonus of 48 to back that up. So overall, a decent General's Bodyguard unit. I would definitely recommend you use that over your other options. So as you can see, you have a fairly small roster here, so hopefully that means we can get this done nice and quick for a change. Let's check out your skirmishers. Now first up, we have the Celtiberian Youth Skirmishers right here. These guys are fairly generic, as is all of your skirmishers, unfortunately. There is something worth mentioning about them though, is that they have a melee attack of 7 and a defense of 12 with a charge bonus of 18, which is pretty poor. But they have a weapon damage of 22 with an armor piercing of 4. So basically, these guys are not terrible for melee. They're not great, and they only have an armor of 1, so they still get destroyed. But they're not as terrible as what a lot of other skirmishers are in DI these days. So that's not too bad, really. Although they seem to all have exactly the same faces. At least almost exactly the same. Wow, I've never noticed that before with a unit in DI. That's funny. But anyway, that's all there is to say about that Javelin unit, though. Then we bump up things to your Celtiberian Slingers. Unfortunately, these guys are actually even more generic and worse in every way possible, except for their range, which they have a regular range of a Slinger, which is 190. But that's it. They don't even have good melee stats. No armor. Just, yeah, don't use these guys if you can, because on turn 1, you can recruit Balearic Slingers, which are miles ahead of these guys. So, if you can avoid it, don't use these guys at all. Do not recommend whatsoever, really. Nothing good to say at all. Now, let's check out your Celtiberian Skirmishers right here. Unfortunately, these guys are actually even more generic than the last skirmishers we talked about, your Celtiberian Youths. And they have worse stats across the board. Your Celtiberians are better in almost literally every single way, except for one thing I'm noticing, which is that the Celtiberians have an ammunition of 6, whereas the Celtiberian Youths here have an ammunition of just 5. But statistically speaking, they're worse across the board in every way compared to the Celtiberian Youth. So, use the Youths if and when you can as possible. I would not recommend using these guys at all, really. They're not very good, and they're just very low tier javelin men. And then we move on to your Celtiberian Ambushers. Now these guys, they're kind of a little strange because statistically they're almost the same as these other two units that we've discussed. The main thing that they have over them both is a melee attack of 9, whereas the other two only get as high as 7, but their defense is way lower at 6 compared to 12 for the youth. So, yeah, these Celtiberian Ambushers are pretty subpar, to be honest. They have a nice weapon damage of 24, but only a defense of 6 and a charge bonus of 16, which isn't even good at all. That's pretty disappointing for these guys. I would think a unit known as the Ambushers would actually be good on the charge. In addition, they don't even have guerrilla deployment. When I see the word Ambusher in a name for a unit, I expect them to have guerrilla deployment, so perhaps that was an oversight? I'm not too sure. It's a little bit of a letdown, to be honest. We have 3 different types of javelin men here. All of them are pretty similar in stats, although you probably should just get the youth skirmishers instead. At least if you want them to last a little bit longer, because these guys have better defense. The ambushers are a little bit more aggressive, so it's up to you if you want to focus more on surviving or dealing damage. And then just don't use the Celtiberian skirmishers, because while they have a better defense than the ambushers, their attack is abysmal at 6. So I wouldn't bother going to them. To me, it's between the ambushers or between the youth skirmishers. Moving forward though, we have the melee section. Straight up, we have your Celtiberian painted warriors. These guys are glowing in this beautiful Iberian sunset. It's a very powerful sun, hence why they're a little bit brighter than what would be normal. I could try and turn the reshade off perhaps, but I don't have the brightness and gamma adjusted, so these guys are going to be a little bit more shiny than what they normally would be. But anyway, these guys, while they look pretty badass, I mean, you know, you have to have pretty big balls to want to charge into battle naked. That means that they don't have any armor whatsoever. However, the main thing that they do have is a base morale of 49, which is pretty massive. They have a weapon damage of 24 plus an armor piercing of 4, so that means they have around 28 weapon damage total. But they have a melee attack of 16, and that's just a base attack of 16. That will go up extremely quickly with a good general. That's really impressive. And that's something we're going to see with all of your other sword units, is a very high melee attack. Pretty much across the board. And these guys also have 300 men per unit, so that helps out. A melee defense of 8, which isn't terrible. How much is based on the shield? Just 4, so it's split in half. Okay, it's not bad at all. But what is bad is that they don't have any armor whatsoever, so that is going to be a big shame. They'll get annihilated by any kind of javelins, really. Moving forward, though, we have your Celtiberian swordsmen. Now, these guys are kind of what you would use in a main battle line. And in fact, I probably would use them in a main battle line. They have an armor of 20, so it should help them last a little bit against enemy skirmisher fire. Melee defense of 7, melee attack of 14. Total weapon damage of 26, combining the AP and the weapon damage. Charge bonus is only at 16 though, so you don't really have any heavy hitters on the charge when it comes to infantry, so keep that in mind. It's just because you guys are kind of stealthy and, you know, appear to be focused on ambushing, but yeah, not really too much else to say for the Celtiberian swordsmen. They're fairly decent, low to barely mid tier. Yeah, I'll call them mid tier barbarian swordsmen. That's basically what they are. And they have more armor than what you would expect for a barbarian faction at 20, so that's nice. But beyond that, that's kind of it. We then have your Celtiberian light infantry, which are lighter, which means that they are basically worse in almost every single way. The main thing that they have over your other swordsmen is a higher speed of 2 for the swordsmen and 3 for these guys. However, the speed in Rome 2 is not actually a whole number measurement, it's done in decimals. So just because one unit says 3 on the UI and the other says 2, it might only be a small tiny difference of like 0.1 or something like that. So don't get your hopes up too much that these guys are going to be super fast. Chances are they're probably not all that quick, especially since it's such a big unit. It's going to take a while for your unit to like turn or something like that, you know what I mean? So yeah, decent light infantry unit, but I just wouldn't really use them when you can use the Celtiberian swordsman instead. So if you can, use the Celtiberians, the generic swordsman. Don't bother with the light infantry. We then come to possibly your best infantry unit that you get access to. In fact, comparing it to your next one, yeah, I would say this is your best infantry unit you get access to. Your Celtiberian champions. Now, despite these guys having very good stats, such as an 18 melee attack, that is astronomical. That is very, very, very high. And keep in mind, again, as soon as these guys get a little bit of XP and they get a good general leading them, that melee attack will skyrocket. You could get it into mid-20s very easily. It's going to be insanely powerful. However, your melee defense is only at 9, which isn't too terrible considering how high your attack is, so I wouldn't stress about that too much. Charge bonus is at 19, pretty poor but not terrible. Weapon damage, a total of 28, which is pretty solid though, and an armor 25, which is nice. Plus, these guys do have the stealth mechanics of the last 2 units we talked about with the guerrilla deployment, so that's 3 sword units that you have that have guerrilla deployment. So yeah, these Celtiberian champions are just a fantastic unit. That armor 25 really comes in, plus those stealth capabilities. These guys really are champions. Very nice. They just don't really have armor piercing, so they won't do amazing against, say, legionnaires. They'll still probably win in a one-on-one against a legionnaire unit, but they won't have the stamina of a legionnaire. And if you can get them, try to use these guys to recharge enemy formations if possible, because they do have the stealth mechanics, which should help you get them behind enemy lines. Yeah, you need to be careful with relying on units like this, especially considering they come from your elite social class, so be very careful about that. You can lose access to them very quickly if you don't manage your population very well. And then come to your last sword unit, which is your Celtiberian swordsman. Unfortunately, this is, I believe, the lowest tier your swordsmen get to. Let's compare it very quickly. Yeah. Low in every single category compared to your other swordsmen. I'm not really sure why you would use this. I don't even think it comes from a different social class compared to your Celtiberian swordsmen. So the main difference is that these guys are much faster. You can see here the bar is actually quite high in the difference. Oh, and these guys have this stalk ability when being stealthy, whereas the Celtiberian swordsmen just have guerrilla deployment. By the way, the stalk ability allows a unit to walk across the map and not be spotted. I'm not sure if it includes running. I think running might be a mixed bag. It depends on the terrain, but at the very least, it guarantees that it will be hidden while walking until it gets very close to enemy units. So that's pretty helpful. But its stats are just way lower than the others, and they already have some stealth capabilities. So I'd probably just focus on the Celtiberian swordsman. Yeah, that's it for your swordsman. Some decent stuff. You can form a main battle line, but I would wager that the Lusitani main battle line will definitely give you a good run for your money. I'm not sure about the Editani though. You might just have the edge over them. Anyway, let's move on to your spearmen now. Alrighty, here we are, checking out the Arevaci Armored Shock Infantry. This is one of your general's bodyguard units. Now, one thing to note about these guys is this is definitely one of your better looking units. Look at this. Oh, hang on, no, not the knee, the face. Look at them, they have chainmail over their face. Isn't that insane? They got fur, bear fur collars or vests on, and very colorful shields, awesome looking helmets, just wow. Very impressive with their look. This is where you really start to see the difference in how elite units can look compared to the plebby ones. The plebs looked okay. Wasn't nothing wrong with them, except they're just not very well armored and don't have all that much clothing. So these guys are, you know, pretty limited in their cool look. This elite unit here you have looks amazing. Really, really nice. But how is it in a battle? Well, your armored shock infantry here, I guess you could call them shock infantry. It's kind of awkward because they're a spear unit, and spearmen typically aren't used to be a shock type of unit. Spearmen just aren't. I mean, I can't think of any unit off the top of my head that I would think of as being, oh yeah, that's a shock unit, and it is using a spear. It throws a javelin maybe before, but not a spearman unit, so that's interesting. But their stats kind of say otherwise. They have a pretty decent melee attack of 9, a whopping melee defense of 21. That's what I would see in a very elite spearman unit. Charge bonus of 21, which is kind of respectable for a heavy spear unit like this. Weapon damage of 26 plus 4 armor piercing damage gives it 28 in total. And then a pretty solid bonus versus cavalry and elephants of 14 each. And an armor of 35, base morale of 49. Basically, I don't see this as a shock infantry unit. I see this as an elite spear unit that is actually very, very good. And once again, we are seeing some nice stealth mechanics. You will notice throughout the majority of your core infantry that are melee focused, we are seeing guerrilla tactics being used. It does come in as a pretty major part of your battle strategies. Almost all of your swordsmen have it, although none of your skirmishers have it and none of your cavalry have it. Not even your general's bodyguard. He doesn't have guerrilla deployment, unfortunately. But anyway, that is your Vasky Armored Shock Infantry. Basically, and a very elite spearman unit. Use them wisely. Then things kind of go downhill from there. We have your Celt-Iberian Light Spearmen. These guys are barely just a step above your levies. In fact, can I see the levy? No, we can't. Yeah, it's not even displayed here as part of your core roster, so I would say this unit would be your bottom tier unit, basically a levy spearman. One respectable thing is a melee defense of 14, but besides that, stats are very poor overall. I would not recommend you use them, although again, even with your levies, we still see some guerrilla deployment tactics being used, and they have campaign stealth, which is nice, so pretty useful considering that, but their stats are pretty mediocre as well, so don't let them get stuck in a head-on fight unless you just want them to soak up arrow fire, which they could do very well actually, because of their large shields, so maybe use them as cannon fodder. That might be pretty useful for you. Then though, things kind of go back up a fair bit, where we have the Celt-Iberian Armored Scutari. These guys have a decent melee attack of 7, defense of 17, which is pretty massive, and an armor 25. This is basically a solid high tier unit for you. I wouldn't call it elite, not just yet. We're close to your other elite spearmen. But yeah, this is a very solid spearman unit. If you really need them to, they can hold a good battle line for you. And in fact, I might even recommend it because of their massive melee defense and really good armor at 25. Really good for a barbarian faction at least. So you could use these in a mainline battle line. Sorry. However, you do need to be aware of your population that you draw them from. Be careful of that. But fantastic unit. They look awesome. Pretty solid for a high tier spearman unit. Then we move on to your Celt-Iberian heavy infantry. These guys are definitely a step up in just about every single category. They also still have the campaign and guerrilla deployment. The campaign stealth and guerrilla deployment, sorry. They look amazing, massive shield. They have a javelin that they can throw in before they get into combat, and yeah, just super impressive stats. These guys, they will hold a main battle line for a very long time. This is almost like sending in your Triari into the battle like how the Romans do. Very nice, very highly armored, very well trained, very well disciplined with a morale of 52, so definitely recommend picking up these guys when you can. And then we jump up to your Celt-Iberian Spearmen. This is the second bottom tier Spearman unit that you get, barely just making it above the Celt-Iberian Light Spearmen, just because they have a higher armor. The Light Spearmen have only an 8 armor. Your generic Spearmen here have an armor of 20, which is actually kind of respectable. Still have the stealth mechanics. However, the speed is only at 2 while the others are at 3. But yeah, not a terrible unit, but I would rather save up my social class for more effective units. Yeah, I don't know, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. You could use them to be a fairly helpful unit, especially early on when you don't really have access to your elites and stuff. So that's up to you if you want it. Hey, go back. But yeah, I prefer sword-based armies, so I wouldn't use these guys all that much, but the stats aren't terrible considering they're pretty low on the rank of your units, really. Then we have your Celt-Iberian Scutari. Compare them to the heavy Scutari, which is here. They have almost the exact same stats, except 10 less armor, and 3 less morale, and 1 more speed. So yeah, Celt-Iberian Scutari, they're not bad at all. These guys can also help form a main battle line for you, although their armor is only at 15. Let's compare that to the Spearmen next to them. The Spearmen have an armor of 20, but they have a melee defense of 14. Whereas the Scutari start off with a melee defense of 17, which is pretty massive. But 14 is still excellent, so yeah, I might wait. I probably wouldn't get these Scutari. I'd wait until I could recruit the heavy version, the more armored Scutari, because they're fantastic, but Why would you settle for something that has 10 less armor? That's pretty substantial. 10 armor is a pretty big difference in my opinion. Yeah, I would wait for the armored Scutari. But anyway, that's all of your spearmen. Now let's check out your cavalry very quickly. And then that's it for the military section. We're almost done already, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a quick one so far. Alrighty, and now let's get started with your cavalry. We have the Celtiberian heavy cavalry that you get access to. This is probably your most elite tier cavalry unit that you get access to. Very good armor at 38, and whopping melee attack at 13, defensive 14, charge bonus 37, weapon damage at 32, plus an AP of 3, giving you a total of 35 weapon damage. These guys are very powerful, very melee focused, but they can still do damage on the charge, and they are not to be underestimated whatsoever. These guys are what you'll be needing combined with other AOR mercenary heavy cavalry units to defeat Carthage. So use these guys to tie up their Numidians and crush them, and bring in maybe some cheap spearmen to help out, help the process go a little bit faster. Then we move on to your Celtiberian riders. These guys are more charge orientated. They have the lance right there. They're very similar to your general's bodyguard in statistics. However, these guys are much lighter, so they have a speed of 6, but only an armor of 18, which is pretty low. Melee defense of 11, which is actually respectable considering they were fairly light and they only have a small shield. Shield value of 2, so you could get these guys to chase down enemy light cavalry and they'd probably do pretty good in a melee engagement actually. There's nothing wrong with using these guys in melee for an extended period of time. They just don't have good armor, so they'll die to skirmisher fire, and they will lose against high tier cavalry over time. But yeah, decent little shock cav unit that you get access to. Although do keep in mind that you actually do have better mercenary shock cavalry in the area of Iberia, especially in southern Iberia. There's some nice shock cav units, or at least one good shock cav unit that can replace this one. Now let's talk about your skirmisher shock cavalry. Unfortunately, we only have 4 total units of cav, besides your general's bodyguard, of course. Here we have your Celtiberian light cavalry. Not a lot to say about these guys at all, really. Comparing them to your scout riders or Celtiberian riders, they have even lower armor. They have pretty good speed at 7, though. Melee attack of 13, defensive 10, so they actually have better melee attack and defense. No, just melee attack than your shock cav, your light shock cav, that is. Weapon damage is 32 plus 3 armor piercing, giving you a total of 35 damage. It's actually pretty good. Yeah, that's interesting. The charge is, the damage is better than your shock cav unit that you have. Your light shock cav unit, that is. Overall, it's not a terrible unit here. You could use these guys to skirmish the enemy to death, and then you could also get them involved in a melee engagement. They don't look like they have armor. I wonder if that armor rating is correct. Oh no, it is 13. So where's the defense come from? Base value of 8 with a shield value of 2. So they just must be very skilled riders. That's where that defense comes from. Got defense and armor mixed up there. Sorry guys, it's late while I'm recording this. It's been a long day. But looking very badass. Very, very nice, and obviously extremely skilled. Very arguable to use these guys over your light shock cav that we're just checking out earlier. Very awesome. And then it actually takes a pretty big jump down to your Celtiberian skirmisher cavalry. They have a lot of lower statistics. Is it across the entire board? Let's check very quickly. They have way faster speed at 8 compared to 7, but beyond that, the Celtiberian light cavalry have better stats across the board, it looks like. At least where it counts. The main difference would be the speed and the shots per minute, which these guys have a little bit faster at 7 compared to 5, which is actually kind of substantial. But I don't think that's going to win or lose you a battle. Not a terrible unit, but you basically would just want to use the other skirmisher unit. I don't know why you would use this one instead. Maybe because it's very, very fast and it could chase down Carthaginian and Numidian cavalry. So maybe think about that. But even then, the AI isn't great at controlling cav. You could just chase them to the red line if you have to, or into terrain. So I wouldn't really be using these guys, to be honest. They're not terrible though. They're just, there's better versions of them, or a better version of them. So yeah, I'll use a better version, but that's just my opinion. And everyone plays with their roster differently, but that's it for the Arevaci roster. As you can see, you have a lot of units that are focused on guerrilla deployment. Despite that though, you don't always have to use guerrilla deployment. You can offer a main battle line and then just use 1 or 2 units in guerrilla deployment to hit the enemy at the right time. But yeah, very interesting roster. Quite clearly focused on spearmen and swordsmen to try and get you the edge over the enemy infantry. And then you have some good cavalry to come in and try and deal with the enemy cav. Although, if they focus on cav, you could definitely struggle against them. And of course, your skirmishers are terrible. Avoid using them pretty much entirely. Focus on AOR and mercenary skirmishers. But anyway, now it's time to get to the part 3 verdict. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's do it. Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the part 3 section of this video where we check out the verdict for the Arevaci. We'll talk about the difficulty, tips and tricks, and any last minute thoughts that I have to share with you guys. Very quickly though, I do just want to state that the reforms, the Nitos reforms for the Arevaci occur when you reach the Imperium level of 4, and you have to have hit at least turn 90 to get them. They're not that dramatic and they're not too needy, but it is worth noting that you do have to get to Imperium level 4, which won't take you too long. It should basically be conquering all of Iberia, maybe a little bit more, and you'll get there. So good luck with that. But anyway, let's talk about the verdict for the Arevaci. So we have an interesting early game position. On one hand, it seems difficult because Carthage is right next door to you. However, it really depends on how useful the AI can be during your campaign. A lot of the time, they can't really send their armies to the right place at the right time, especially when they have a faction like Carthage that has its cities so spread out. So even though I actually initially considered the start for this faction to be difficult, I think it's actually not that bad. And in fact, it's almost getting into easy territory just because so many of your neighbors have rosters that are about the same as you, if not slightly worse, except the major factions such as the Lusitani and the Editani. But the generic Iberian factions around you, they're around the same level as you, if not slightly lower, which means you should be able to handle them pretty much without issue. So overall, your early game position is actually pretty easy in my opinion. But you do need to keep in mind that Carthage is literally in your starting province, and their army completely outclasses yours in every single way. You will have to use some very good stealth tactics to outflank them and get the job done against them. Then of course, we don't even need to talk about how difficult it will be for you to deal with Rome though. You have almost no units that deliver any armor piercing of any substantial degree. So you will have to really rely on your cavalry there, or get some AOR merc units that do have armor piercing as a main attribute of their stats. Rome in the mid to late game will be a really big issue for you. Good luck fighting them. But then that leads me to my next point, which is you need to keep in mind that since you are playing as a barbarian faction, your navy is terrible. I said this earlier, I'll say it again, which is why I didn't cover it in the part 2 section, because your navy is just pretty much abysmal. You only have a couple units that are really terrible anyway. But your navy is very bad, and it gets absolutely outclassed by the Carthaginians. And because of that, your cities, your coastal cities, will be very much under threat pretty much throughout your entire war with them. You'll fight them almost no matter what, really. You'll have to kick them out of Iberia. It just won't work otherwise. And you'll lose some valuable cities if you don't kick them out. And in which case, though, you might need to be leaving quite a few small garrisons in addition to your town garrisons along your coastal cities. Or have some armies nearby that can respond very quickly to sieges to reinforce your cities. But basically, the Navy can really impact you, especially if you're playing against another player, because they know that they can use and abuse that against you if they're playing as a civilized faction. But yeah, that's just one thing to keep in mind about that. And then there's another final thing I want to talk about, which is where is the Arevaci class between the Lusitani and the Editani? I feel like this kind of warrants a video on its own where I talk about what would be the best Iberian faction. Off the top of my head though, right now as it stands without me doing too much research into the topic, I would say that the Lusitani have the better out of the 3 faction rosters, putting the Arevaci very close to the Editani, if not slightly lower than the Editani actually. Their roster is just not all that great. You rely pretty heavily on guerrilla deployment and swarming tactics, and using cavalry to try and deal with the enemy cav. But that's kind of it. You don't really have much skirmishing capability at all. You have some basic javelins, but I mean, you know, you can use them and abuse AI kind of with it. But any decent player will deal with your javelins pretty easily. But that's basically it for the Part 3 verdict. I don't have a lot to say on these guys that I haven't already said. Their economy is kind of rough early on. Your early game position is actually pretty good because of the good diplomacy relations that you have with other factions nearby. However, overall your military is fairly poor. Not really all that well trained, although they are fairly skilled in attack. So you're definitely going to be focused on being an aggressive nation, or at least getting the enemy armies to attack you first so you get that extra bit of morale, and then once the battle is initiated, that's when you start pushing them and hitting them hard with that good melee attack stat that you have with so many of your units. But unfortunately, again, you just don't have any armor piercing. However, where does that leave us with a difficulty rating? Well, you would think because of their pretty big population issues and their fairly weak roster overall, that they would be a fairly hard faction. However, one major thing nips this in the bud pretty quickly in my opinion, and that is that you are a barbarian faction, an Iberian faction, literally in the heartland of Iberia. That means that almost in any direction you go, you're going to be conquering other Iberians and people who consider themselves to be of the Iberian culture, which means you'll have a lot of population at your disposal. You'll have tens of thousands of people ready to come and join your armies upon occupying just a few more cities. That means that you can then use swarming tactics to deal with the Carthaginians. Once they're out of Iberia, then the game's pretty much a cakewalk, except for when you have to face Rome, because their armies will definitely outclass yours, and you'll be really relying on mercenaries and AOR units. I recommend trying to get elephants from Africa or something to help you out. It's right there, you may as well go try and get them. But yeah, Rome, the Diadochi factions will definitely outclass you, but you can probably handle that by the time you start facing them, because you'll be such a juggernaut faction by then anyway. But yeah, the difficulty rating was going to be around the hard level because of the poor roster. But because Iberia is such a good location, you have good population around you, despite your population issues yourself, you can still remedy that fairly quickly by taking all these other Iberian cities very close to you. Plus, Carthage, while it seems like it could be a massive issue, typically it won't be. You have to be pretty unlucky for them to send a good amount of armies your way. Combining all of these factors and more, in my opinion, the Arevaci are a 5 out of 10, an average faction to play as. I was nearly going to go into easy territory, however, their roster is just really, really poor. And going up against Rome and pretty much any Greek faction is going to be a struggle for you. You will be able to swarm them and use the massive population of Iberia to do pretty well. However, if you don't specialize at least a couple armor-piercing units in dealing with their units, that's where you're really going to struggle. So I would really recommend that you try to fix that as soon as possible by trying to get some elephants or some very good shock cavalry, or perhaps some Gauls that are good in armor-piercing damage, although there isn't really all that many that are. But anyway, the main thing is that you need to get something to fix this gaping hole in your roster, which is your lack of armor penetration. You probably could try to fix the skirmishing department fairly quickly as well. Although you do have Polaric Slingers available to you on turn 1 via the mercenary recruitment pool, which will be massive. And once you take over their city there on the Balearic Islands, you'll then also get them as an AOR unit when you recruit them from the town itself. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think they're a 5 out of 10. I think they're pretty average. The mid to late game could definitely be considered to be difficult, but by that point you should be large enough to where it doesn't really matter what faction you go up against. You should be able to auto-resolve battles away, or just swarm the enemy to death with thousands of angry Iberians. But ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the faction overview of the Arevaci. Thank you all so much for tuning in and watching. Our next faction overview, by the way, will be Bactria. We've had an insane amount of requests about it for a very long time, and I think it is about time we go back and check out Bactria in the Far East. So that will be our next faction overview. After that, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But until then, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.